Osamu Tezuka's Metropolis from 2001. It's a very special film to me, and one that at the time was reviewed fondly. It was a real hallmark project, though it didn't perform commercially for a film with its budget. Since its debut years, I've seen some divergent points on the film online about its lack of narrative depth or how it's a bit muddled. And some of these origins go back to its release. The did lament on its narrative pitfalls, or lack thereof narrative, remarking its visual flair it carried the film. And in some ways he's not wrong. The visual flair really is one of Rintaro's defining aspects to this film. It was a Rintaro passion project, one that he'd wanted to do for a very long time. Take into consideration that Rintaro has been working with Tezuka and in the anime industry for over 50 years, and that he started working on Tezuka productions since the beginning of Astro Boy on TV. He's worked on countless different adaptations of Tezuka's work, including some of his most fine and acclaimed. Once more, he brought on Otomo, Akira's Otomo, to write the script. And make no mistake here, this was not created in mind of being a simple story. Otomo was dedicated to this narrative. He was intending this project to have sci-fi depth and to be effective, to watch as a sci-fi adventure story. He was proud with the results. He respected where the original story was coming from, but wanted to bring, I guess, his own flair. And as the creator of Akira, someone who's specifically interested in post-war themes and the rebellious attitude, you can kind of see where he's coming from. It was the Rintaro that brought Otomo into the industry to begin with. It was a power dynamic, as well as having the whole of Madhouse on their side, with 5 years of development time, as well as Tezuka Productions giving some backup. So it's funny to think that during Tezuka's life, this was a project that he did not, and I repeat, did not want Rintaro to produce. Rintaro first asked during the 60s, and he was never given a reason why Tezuka didn't want it on the screen. He possibly speculates it may have something to do with it being a formative work of his, or that he didn't think the technology was perhaps there. However, Rintaro was very dedicated to the idea, as you can tell by the amount of time he put into it, and he wanted to do it with the spirit of Tezuka in mind. Rintaro's goal seemed to be to make a Metropolis film that would fit in our time. Not one that is just post-war, but post-Cold War and post-economic crash. One where the rise of nationalism in Japan is poking its head out again. This iteration builds on top of both priors. To summarize it in both a simplistic and contentious way, Metropolis, the original film, spoke to the coming dangers of fascism and class unrest, where Tezuka's version talks more about the coming uprising of machines and the dangers that come with that. Now, if we look at the final product, it is dense. Compressed, you could say, as if it had enough ideas to fill a whole 2.5-hour movie, but couldn't spend another 5 years to get that out there. So they've tried to trim it down and condense it to the best of their abilities, which means there's a lot going on, which sometimes will pass you by. And some of that stuff isn't the most obvious. So with this kind of video, I'm planning to sort of break down a lot of the internal workings of Metropolis. Although the first conceit I need to give is that if there's one video you should be watching on Metropolis on YouTube, it is Pause and Selects, who I will be using as a basis for some of the points I'm making while expanding on it. I'm mainly going to be talking about the anime film and not the manga or the original, but they may come up tangentially. To quote one of the Japanese voice actors, you can't understand this movie while seeing it once. And I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. Metropolis is a film that carries itself on its visual dynamics. You can ride the wave all the way to the credits. So let's start with getting into the character dynamic here, which is very important for understanding how the plot comes together in the end. We have Duke Red, who is a populist figure with a lot of vocal support as a rich, famous, charismatic industrialist. There's an idea that he's so popular that he should become a political figure, even though he has no background in such an area. And that's where we start getting onto this idea of nationalistic concepts, to lead with a strong, singular leader, to get the people to rally against, regardless of what he stands for. In the past, Duke Red lost his daughter, leaving a hole in his life, a longing that he cannot fill even if he tries. In this time period, he adopted an orphan that happens to lead his fascist-esque private militia. This boy's name is Rock, and he is a broken child, twisted by xenophobia and, I'm imagining, a very upsetting upbringing. A war orphan to begin with, and that sort of leads to his dedication for his savior, his father, Duke Red, and he plans to get his approval whatever the cost. However, as the story unfolds, we realize that a new child is coming into the picture, or should I say robot, and this causes an immense amount of jealousy within Rock, who will do anything he can to remove this person, and is endlessly driven by this, which befalls him into a downward spiral, all to stop Tima, the life's work of Dr. Lawton, as a robot indistinct from humans, so much so that she can feel, think, and learn as much as any other. Does that make her human? Can a heartless robot fall in love? The character that starts off the narrative direction is Kenichi, a young assistant to his uncle, a private detective. This is how he gets intertwined into the situation with Tima, causing what is the core of the story, these two's relationship. These three characters set up the sort of themes around love and loss, possession, that will be used broadly through the plot as we go on, as well as the undertone of the dangers of ultra-nationalism. So the beginning of the 2000s and the 90s saw a rise in nationalism after the crash of the economic market, which did have something to do with real estate, among other things. We're setting up a pastiche of American cities, Art Deco, very similar to a Manhattan of yesteryear, one that seems to reverse cyberpunk tropes of transnationality. Instead of taking from Asian iconography, the city is inherently American, as well as the musical language that surveys the film. But while the city is inherently American in iconography, the story tends to focus more on a Japanese cultural background, especially when it comes to Cigarette, an icon of the city. Finishing its completion at the beginning of the film is a pillar of man's hubris, not dissimilar to the Tower of Babel, one that dedicates itself to its own greatness and happens to look very similar to a certain Japanese government building, the government's headquarters in particular. To quote, "The cigarette brings sovereignty and identity and focuses it into a single point, one that will ascend it to the heavens." Certainly it's also a callback to the original Metropolis film, in the way the taller we get, the more disparaging the class difference become. The film's visual iconography does a great job of building up the atmosphere of a city. It's dense, colourful, and multi-layered. It really builds up a sort of context of how the inner workings of the city is built vertically, each class getting further disgruntled the further you go down. To bring the city alive to the standard and scale they did, there was a mixture of cell animation and CGI, a breakthrough, and Madhouse is not exactly one to step away from this, considering their work in Lensman. They were melding worlds more so common today, but was not in 2001. And they did so in such a way that they could use the new technologies, the computer generations, to do things that were not possible in cell animations, but not to try and replicate stuff that would look better in cell animation, but something to elevate the overall image and art direction. I'm sure one could argue that some of it looks a bit dated nowadays, especially in pivotal scenes, but for the time it was a revolution. The neon-lit past infused with a dash of cyberpunk. It is a warm, glistening retro future, one where the rights of robots mean very little. There is a xenophobic fear in the air about robots, and robots seem to be an allegory for the immigrants, the lowest class of workers, those treated like machines. Now, to get back to Duke Red, his private group, a public secret as it's told, this militia involves Rock being his right-hand man because of his promising abilities. He seems to be more of a sociopath. There's nothing that he won't do, especially if someone gets in his way. To the detriment of Duke Red later on, Duke is using his money and power to affect things politically, but under a sheet of secrecy. The group push his political interest and are described as fascist-like, which, in everything but name, In everything but name. Through the inequality of the city and the different levels of the hierarchy of class, there are many rebels in the city who have lost their jobs and have lost their food stamps. They are left in a state of desperate revolt. Using the language of the French, it's a class uprising who have nothing left to lose, showing how strained the population is, and also that they're gaining a resentment towards the automation that left them in such a state. Because of this, they begin the uprising. Now, you could necessarily look at these people as revolutionary, perhaps even Marxist in their class identity. There is some indications from their location through the background and the way they speak. However, Bird argues that it's more of a conservative uprising in nature, looking for a return to the past, which is manipulated into use for the nationalists. Their mistrust of robots is used against them as a distraction to gain more power, and using military force to gain that power, snatching the ruling seat from the crumbling, corrupt democracy. Within the animation, you can definitely tell how each character is defined individually. The chases and action set pieces within the film definitely hold to that quality, but they define these characters' interactions and their relationship, building it through a union of chaos that they have to survive. The thematical musical numbers are something really exceptional. The use of leitmotif through the whole project is quite staggering. To quote the director at the time, who always finds music to be one of the most important aspects of his animation projects, the melody needs to be strong. It can't be focusing on the instrumentation itself. It needs to sound great, memorable, even when hummed. And that gives them a lot of leeway to change the tempo, change the instrumentation, but to keep that melody alive, the melody of the city. And the city uses a fundamental different iconography than in the general sci-fi. It is New Orleans jazz, done through a Japanese score. There are certain elements of a classical big band score, and perhaps even elements of more electronic within, but they are all neatly tied together with the overall jazz sensation. And this makes for some unique viewings in certain scenes. Tima appears, a white illuminated figure. The jazz stings, a sultry tone. When this kind of music is used in the West, it tends to be considered quite seductive. Though I don't know if that's a tone expected from this scene. This scene is more Fantastic Planet than Maltese Falcon, after all. And it may be a cultural difference here, but originally American jazz within films, especially in post-war films, like the work of Akira Kurosawa, tend to be used to show things that are seedy, dark, violent, other. Perhaps it's used in a sort of exotic way. And certainly if you look at the name of the score, The Free-Faced of Zone, you have to kind of break that down. What does free-faced mean? Free-faced, since this music is instantly connected with Tima, must, I assume, be referring to her. Dante coined this term when talking about the devil, worse than two-faced, but also having a desire to become like a god, Holy Trinity in mind, the three forms. Tima herself could be considered to have three forms: the human, the robot, and the goddess. In some ways, this is a foreshadowing to that event. Because looking at it further, the way Tima hits the light, the way her hair flows, she makes a striking resemblance to the concept of the sun goddess, Amaterasu, in that scene. But I think it's more than just that. You have to somewhat move away from the Western sensibilities for a moment to think about what this scene represents. It isn't necessarily that Tima is angelic in the scene, but what she's standing over in the central part of the screen that's really important. It is a representation on the floor of the sun that she is shining down on. Amaterasu the god means shining in heaven. Her position within the plot will be to become the person who masters the power of the sun, the symbol of Japan, something that will be able to control the world. She will be the soft power anime girl on top of the tower in the heavens. When we also look at Rock as a character, musically, it seems that strings and ones with a down tempo represent his character. Even within different associations of the jazz scenes, the music instantly changes to a more orchestral score as soon as he appears, always having this deep sadness to it. As entertaining as Rock is to watch, there is definitely something wrong with him. He's so compelled that, even if his actions are so ugly, there is a form of sympathy for him overall, for a character that wasn't even in the original manga and was added to create conflict and tension within the story, to give Tima an opposite, I could say. If there's one message of the film that seems to come out in the character's voice, it would be that history has a habit of repeating itself when you don't learn from it. The ziggurat fails. The nationalism is used to demonize those at the bottom, to keep the people distracted, and to force them to fight among themselves, so those at top can gain more towards the heavens. Towards the ending, all the pieces of the puzzle come together. Ultra-nationalism takes hold. On the Red Throne, Tima's identity creates an existential crisis within her, but in seeing the devastation that happens to the robot class, she questions about such violence. Because at the end of the day, all these robots seem to be sentient enough that to treat them with such callousness seems cruel, What makes them different? What makes someone human? And that was really a question that we seem to unlock in this ending. Why do humans easily destroy robots? What is it to be human? The robots uprise and take down the people, and we get into things like love, loss, and possession. Now, Duke Red feels some sort of love for the loss of his daughter, but he also sees it as a possession to use to gain unlimited power. There is a sort of distorted ideal there. Same with Rock. Rock loves his father, but there's also a possessiveness towards how Tima cannot exist in this world. He needs to get rid of her, and dedication to validate himself within his father. And finally, you get into the other dynamic here with Tima and Kenichi. There is certainly a love between them. It's innocent more so. Kenichi just wants to be with Tima. There isn't necessarily a form of possession to it, and the feeling seems to be mutual. But in the end, the song says it all. Even Kenichi can't let go. I'll just live my life in the dreams of yesteryear. Not dissimilar to an ultra-nationalistic output. It all seems to combine. The lyrics of the song thematically close the book on all characters involved, and this is not a point that I'm making alone. It is usually contested by other academics. Tima and her goddess-like abilities there, they use nationalism in a dangerous way, although it collapses and she's able to find a different way of existing. As she falls, it may seem like it's all over, but you do realise there are flares of hope. Kenichi also can't let go, and he decides to stay in the city and try and search for Tima, to hold on to that memory. But we do see that Tima, whose final words, "I am who," really define her existential problem here. Is she a robot? Is she a person? Now, Green would read this as removing of her identity, that she becomes a blank slate. But then I'd counter with, in her final lines of resurrection, she has a sort of Kami-like position, resurrected as a standard item. It seems that the girl had a soul, after all, and she remembers something from her prior existence. She's not a blank slate. She perhaps is human and did learn to love, which is further elaborated in the final still. It seems nationalism was able to rebuild itself in a new form, where it can live in harmony with robots and people, one where the class system before is collapsed, and hopefully will be rebuilt into something better. Not only is this a great sequence with a brilliant use of song, it nicely and thematically ties up all the loose ends of the story and characters all coming together at once. The flaws of the character, their issues, all break apart. They were their own demise. And through this last end of days, perhaps a brighter future can arise. This is a one-in-a-kind kind of film, and in some ways a goodbye to the Rintaro 2D feature category. This is the last big film he'd make in that style. While working on a couple of OVAs and 3D films later, this is his final seminal work. And it's quite the way to go out. So yeah, Metropolis is pretty good, and perhaps had more to it than you first expected. Thank you to my patrons. If you want to support the show and keep it going, you know where to check. Thank you to Joven as well. This is the end of Madhouse Month, but perhaps not of series to do with Madhouse. There may well be a series on Satoshi Kon coming up, one of the few talents of Madhouse I didn't talk about during this period. So hopefully we'll see that at some point, and I'll catch you all later.